Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to look at the concept of essence as we find in the distinction between essential properties and accidental properties. So many philosophers think that there are some things that have essences, where an essence is a set of properties that makes the thing in question the thing that it is. The essence of something is what it is that makes it that thing. It is the object's nature. It is what it is to be that object. This contrasts with the accidental properties of the object, which are properties that are not relevant to the object's identity. So Socrates, for instance, is a human being, and he could not have failed to be a human being. Being human is part of what it is to be Socrates. Socrates is a philosopher, but he might not have been a philosopher. Had things gone differently, he might have become a musician instead. He would still have been Socrates, he would still have retained his identity had he been a musician instead. So, being human is part of what it is to be Socrates. Being a philosopher is not part of what it is to be Socrates. So, being human is part of the essence of Socrates, whereas being a philosopher is not. I mean, one way to look at this is that an object can retain its identity through change. When a property can change but an object can retain its identity, that's an accidental property. But there are some properties that are such that if the individual were to change in any of those respects, it would no longer be the kind of thing that it is. Now, much of philosophy is concerned with essences. So, think about a question like, what is knowledge? Well, here we are asking for the essence of knowledge. What properties are necessary and sufficient for a belief to count as knowledge? What is the minimal standard a belief must meet for it to be knowledge? When we take a belief that counts as knowledge, what properties of that belief, if lost, would mean that it's no longer knowledge? Or think about, what is a person? Right? Here we're asking for the essence of a person. Descartes claimed that, I am a thinking thing, right? Mind or thought is essential to me. Body, on the other hand, is not. In principle, I could lose my body, but this would not affect my identity, provided that my mind remains the same. I could survive the death of my body. This is the basic idea. Now, note that the essence of an object is supposed to be independent of how we describe or classify the object. Essences are objective. They're not dependent on human interests or concerns. When we discover the essence of something, we are discovering what the world is like, independent of us. Now, so I've tried to give a sort of intuitive characterization of what essence is supposed to be, and what the distinction is between essential and accidental properties. There are different philosophical theories of essence. Broadly speaking, in contemporary philosophy, there are two approaches to essence. So first of all, there is the modal characterization. On this view, an essential property is a property that an entity has necessarily. So the way that this is put on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is, P is an essential property of O, just in case it is necessary that O has P if O is to exist. Or we could say P is an essential property of O, just in case O has P in all possible worlds in which O exists. The existence of O requires that it has property P. So basically, more precisely, an essential truth is a modal truth. In particular, it's a de re necessary truth about a particular entity. So there's a distinction that philosophers draw between de dicto and de re modality. This distinction isn't all that important, really, but I'll just go over it anyway. So necessity can attach to both propositions and objects. A proposition may be necessarily true, so this is necessity de dicto, or an object may necessarily be a particular way. This is necessity de re. So de dicto necessary claims have the sort of form necessarily O is such that it has property P, right? Or think of this like, the following proposition is necessarily true. O is such that it has property P. So I might say that the proposition Socrates is human is necessarily true. By contrast, de re necessary claims have the form O is such that it is necessarily P. So I might say that being human is a necessary property of Socrates. Socrates is necessarily human. As I said, this distinction isn't really that important in what follows, but what to keep in mind is just when we are talking about necessity on the modal account, we're talking about necessary properties of objects, right? What we're saying is that, you know, the objects in the world have these necessary properties. So on the modal account, the essence of an object is its Dirac necessary properties. So essence is reduced to necessity. The essence of an object is what is true of the object necessarily. That's the modal account. Second, there is the definitional account. On this view, an essence is a real definition. So here's how Kit Fine puts it in his paper, Essence and Modality. I quote, "The notion of definition has application to both words and objects. That just as we may define a word or say what it means, so we may define an object or say what it is. An essence is a non-modal truth which gives the real definition of an entity so that it tells us what it is to be that entity." I mean, the thought is, you know, the essence is going to be those properties that constitute what it is to be that object. And to state the essence is to state the real definition of the object. I'll explain this more later in the video, but that's the basic idea. This definitional account fell out of favour in the 20th century, but Kit Fine presents a series of challenges to the modal account and a defence of the definitional account. So he aims to show that the kind of essence that is important in metaphysics is not the kind that's described by the modal account. So to be clear, Fine accepts that if an object essentially has some property, then it necessarily has that property, but he rejects the converse. An object may necessarily have some property, even though it does not essentially have that property. And he gives a series of cases that are supposed to illustrate this. So let's take a look at them. We'll take a look at Fine's challenges to the modal account. Okay, first challenge. Consider a person, say Socrates. Now consider the mathematical set whose sole member is Socrates. Right, so we have the singleton set, right, just the member Socrates. It is a necessary truth about Socrates that Socrates belongs to this set, to the set whose sole member is Socrates. So necessarily, if Socrates exists, then the singleton set whose sole member is Socrates exists. Necessarily, Socrates belongs to that singleton set if both Socrates and the singleton exist. There is no possible world in which Socrates exists, but the set whose sole member is Socrates does not exist. So, according to the modal account, belonging to this singleton set is an essential property of Socrates. It is part of the essence of Socrates that he is a member of this set. But this seems like the wrong result, because there's nothing about Socrates himself that relates him in any particular way to any mathematical objects. As Fine puts it, there is nothing in the nature of a person which demands that he belongs to this or that set, or which even demands that there be any sets. So to see the problem here, compare these two claims about essences. Right? So claim number one is the singleton set whose sole member is Socrates essentially contains Socrates. Claim number two, Socrates essentially belongs to the singleton set whose sole member is Socrates. Now, the thought is, look, the first proposition here seems true, but the second seems false. I mean, I think the point here is about the relation of dependence. The singleton set whose sole member is Socrates seems to depend upon Socrates in a way that Socrates does not depend upon the set. So it's a mistake to take the singleton set as being part of Socrates' essence. I mean, certainly, maybe we don't frame this in terms of dependence, but there does seem to be an asymmetry here. The first proposition is true, the second proposition is false, but there's no corresponding modal asymmetry. It is a necessary truth about the singleton set that it contains Socrates. It is a necessary truth about Socrates that he is a member of the singleton set, and that is all there is to it. Here is the second objection. Consider two completely distinct objects, say Socrates and the Eiffel Tower. It is a necessary truth that Socrates and the Eiffel Tower are distinct objects. That is, there is no world in which Socrates just is the Eiffel Tower, in which the object designated by the name Socrates just is the object designated by the name the Eiffel Tower. So the current consensus is that statements of non-identity, when true, are necessarily true, assuming that the terms used are rigid designators. A rigid designator is a term which designates the same object in all possible worlds in which that object exists. Proper names, such as the name Socrates, are usually taken to be rigid designators. Compare that with a description such as the teacher of Plato. In the actual world, Socrates was the teacher of Plato, but presumably Plato could have been instructed by somebody other than the person he was in fact instructed by. So the description, the teacher of Plato, picks out different objects in different possible worlds, provided it's interpreted de dicto. So in this world, it picks out Socrates. In another possible world, it picks out somebody else. It picks out Protagoras. By contrast, Socrates could have done lots of different things, but he could not have been somebody other than who he in fact was. The name Socrates picks out Socrates in every possible world in which Socrates exists. So, in the actual world, the object designated by the name Socrates is distinct from the object designated by the name the Eiffel Tower. Each name picks out the same object in all possible worlds in which there is that object. So the name Socrates picks out Socrates in all possible worlds. Suppose then that there's a world in which Socrates and the Eiffel Tower are identical. Well, in that case, in that world, the names Socrates and the Eiffel Tower would designate one and the same object, in which case it would have to be one and the same object in all possible worlds, including the actual world. But we know that, well, in the actual world, Socrates is not identical with the Eiffel Tower. So this is why there cannot be a world in which Socrates is identical with the Eiffel Tower. They are necessarily distinct. But, Fine says, it's not essential to Socrates that he be distinct from the Eiffel Tower. There is nothing in the nature of Socrates that relates him to the Eiffel Tower in any particular way. So it's a necessary truth about Socrates that he is distinct from the Eiffel Tower. But it's no part of Socrates' essence that he is distinct from the Eiffel Tower. Distinctness from the Eiffel Tower should not be taken as one of Socrates' essential properties, or so Fine says. Okay, third, just take any necessary truth, such as 1 + 1 = 2. Since it is true in all possible worlds that 1 + 1 = 2, it is true in all possible worlds in which Socrates exists that 1 + 1 = 2. So it is necessarily the case that if Socrates exists, 1 + 1 = 2. Socrates necessarily has the property of being such that 1 + 1 = 2. And so on for every other necessary truth. So on the modal account, it is part of Socrates' essence that 1 + 1 = 2. But surely there is nothing in the nature of Socrates that makes it such that 1 + 1 = 2. Socrates, considered in himself, has nothing to do with abstract objects like numbers. So, it's not part of his essence. Okay then, just a quick advert. If you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon, where I upload bonus videos. So there's all sorts of bonus content available on Patreon, if you want to throw some cash my way. You can also give a one-off donation on PayPal, and any sort of support you can give, it really helps, goes a long way. I offer private tutoring in philosophy. I have a degree, master's and a PhD in philosophy, so contact me via that email if you're interested. And I have a Discord. And even if you can't do any of that, give the video a like, leave a comment, help it get more views, right? Okay, let's get back to essence. So one problem with the arguments that we've considered so far is that ultimately, they rest on Kit Fine's intuition about what constitutes the essence of Socrates. But what if we don't share Fine's intuitions here? I'll just speak for myself now. It strikes me as actually fine, like perfectly reasonable, that membership of the singleton set, whose sole member is Socrates, that may actually be part of the essence of Socrates. Similarly, that distinctness from the Eiffel Tower may be part of the essence of Socrates. Indeed, my reaction with respect to the second argument is that that's exactly what we would expect, that it's Like, of course, it's part of Socrates' essence that he's distinct from a building made of iron. Socrates has various biological and mental properties that preclude him from being an inanimate object constructed from iron. That seems fine to me. But Fine says that those who don't share his intuition about these cases may simply be conceptually impoverished. So he writes, and I quote, "One cannot, of course, argue a conceptually blind person into recognizing a conceptual distinction any more than one can argue a colorblind person into recognizing a color distinction." I should know that's actually quite a puzzling analogy in this case, because of course we can present evidence and arguments that will convince colorblind people that there is a color distinction, even if we can't. I mean, we can't present evidence or arguments that will make them literally see the colors in question, but we can convince them that there's a distinction there. Similarly, I mean, if somebody is conceptually impoverished, I'm not sure what would prevent us, in principle, from communicating the concepts in some way, or at least communicating that there is a conceptual distinction, even if they can't fully grasp that distinction. So I don't know. I mean, I guess in the end, then, like maybe what we're left with here is you know, a clash of intuitions. Some people might find, well, some people do find Fine's counterexamples compelling, and some of us don't. But perhaps there's a broader worry here, which is we might think, look, this just isn't a context in which intuition is likely to be very reliable anyway. So suppose that we did share Fine's intuition that it is not part of the essence of Socrates, that Socrates is a member of that singleton set. Well, why on earth would all the facts about the essence of an object be intuitive? Why expect intuition to be well placed to reveal that? After all, there are plenty of other facts about objects that are not revealed by intuition. The fact that Socrates' body is composed of eukaryotic cells, the fact that the particles that compose his body are, you know, they behave in all sorts of weird ways as described from, you know, quantum physics. I mean, some of the results from quantum physics are outright counterintuitive, right? You know, I mean, who would have thought that, you know, particles have, you know, who would have thought that there's wave-particle duality and all of that stuff, right? I mean, this is not intuitive at all. So the details of the things that compose an object are not revealed by intuition. Why should the details of an object's essence be revealed by intuition? So this might be a worry about the sorts of arguments we've seen so far. However, Fine does present a few other objections to the modal characterization that maybe go a little bit deeper than sort of mere brute intuitions about what constitutes an object's essence. So here is a fourth concern. So note that if the modal account is correct, the necessary truths will include statements of essence, right? A statement of the essence of object just is a statement of a necessary truth according to the modal account. So suppose that the Eiffel Tower is essentially spatio-temporal, that the Eiffel Tower could not be an abstract object. So, you know, necessarily, if the Eiffel Tower exists, the Eiffel Tower is spatio-temporal. Well, then it follows that just as on the modal account, it's part of the essence of Socrates that 1 + 1 = 2, it will also be part of the essence of Socrates that the Eiffel Tower is essentially spatio-temporal. And similarly, it will be part of the essence of the Eiffel Tower that Socrates is essentially a person with parents. So, what this means is, as Fine says, is that in discovering the nature of but one thing, you thereby also discover the nature of all things. But surely that's not right. I don't discover the nature of everything by discovering the essence of just one thing, right? So the problem is that because, you know, we saw it in the third problem, right, that, you know, if you take any necessary truth, like the 1 + 1 = 2, that then that's going to sort of become part of the essence of Socrates. Well, the problem here is that any statement of essence is going to be a necessary truth. So any statement of essence for any object at all is going to become part of the essence of Socrates. But that just seems, you know, I mean, that's not how it works, right? You know, we don't discover the nature of everything by investigating just one thing. I do think, though, that Fine might perhaps be overstating this problem just a little. So in discovering the nature of Socrates, say, we thereby discover the nature of everything. If we discover Socrates' complete essence. but presumably we will usually only discover part of Socrates' essence. And why expect that we would ever be able to discover the complete essence of anything? Perhaps essences are hidden. Certainly, investigating Socrates does not tell us much, if anything, about the Eiffel Tower, but the modal account would only entail that investigating Socrates would tell us about the Eiffel Tower if it were the case that when we investigate Socrates we discover his complete essence, and presumably we never do that. I mean, still, with that said, there may be still a problem here, which is that it looks like the modal account is going to commit us to a kind of thoroughly relational metaphysics, where the essence of each object is dependent on the essence of every other object. So no object has its own intrinsic identity, as it were. And perhaps the theory of essence should not commit us to such a position. But anyway, fifth objection is that on the modal account, existence becomes part of the essence of everything. So recall that the modal account says that E is the essence of some object O, just in case E is the collection of properties that O has necessarily if O exists. Well, clearly, for any object O, it is necessarily the case that O exists if O exists. Socrates necessarily exists if Socrates exists. So yeah, I mean, if you're assuming, assume that Socrates exists, well, clearly that given that Socrates exists, that's going to necessitate the existence of Socrates. But surely we don't want to say that Socrates essentially exists, that existence is part of Socrates' essence. Though, I must say I'm not entirely sure why we don't want to say that. I mean, of course, the idea that existence is part of an object's essence, that is reminiscent of certain famous arguments for God. God's essence is existence. To say that existence is part of Socrates' essence, that sounds like it commits us to the idea that Socrates must exist, period, no matter what the world is like. But we have to keep in mind exactly how the modal account is framed. So the thought is, some property is part of the essence of Socrates, just in case Socrates has that property necessarily if he exists. So if I say Socrates is essentially a man, that does not mean that Socrates must be a man. That only means that Socrates must be a man if Socrates exists. So existence is part of Socrates' essence, but this is only to say that Socrates necessarily exists if he exists, which is obviously trivial. So it's not like there's some sort of unconditional necessary existence going on here. Indeed, actually, I kind of feel like this account sort of fits rather smoothly with the contemporary consensus that existence is not a property of individuals. I mean, recall the argument from Hume and Kant that there is no difference between conceiving of an object and conceiving that the object exists. I have a video on existence where I talk about this stuff in more detail. I'll link that in the comments. But anyway, if that's right, I mean, if to conceive of an object just is to conceive that the object exists, then it's not actually surprising that existence would count as part of the essence of any object. I mean, the essence is supposed to be what it is to be the object, and part of what it is to be any given object is to exist, right? That's what it is to be, is to exist. So, at least on the contemporary view of the contemporary consensus about existence is that, to be just is to exist. Okay then, so a sixth concern. Fine argues that the modal account can't accommodate certain debates within philosophy. Two philosophers may coherently agree about the modal facts while disagreeing about the essentialist facts. Consider the question: what is the relationship between a person, a body, and a mind? I mean, there are many views that we might take about this, but, here's one sort of debate that might happen. Let's say there are two philosophers, Verity and Sidney, and they agree that a person, a body, and a mind are distinct things. They also agree that each person necessarily has just one body and just one mind, and each person sort of necessarily has whatever body and mind that they're actually associated with. But here's the difference. Verity holds that persons are fundamental, while the body and the mind are both abstractions from the person. So facts about the body and facts about the mind are ultimately dependent on facts about the person. On this view, it's part of the essence of the body and the mind to belong to whatever person they belong to, but it's not part of the essence of a person to have whatever body or mind it has, for the same reason that it's part of the essence of the singleton set to contain Socrates, but it's not part of the essence of Socrates to be a member of that singleton set. Sidney, by contrast, he's a thoroughgoing materialist. He believes the body is fundamental. The person and her mind is a kind of abstraction from the body. The person is, ultimately a biological organism, a biological body. On this view, it is part of the essence of the person and the mind to belong to whatever body they belong to, but it is not part of the essence of a body to belong to the person or mind. So Verity and Sidney are not in dispute about the modal facts, about the relationship between person, body, and mind. They agree that that these three things are all necessarily connected, but there's still a disagreement here, a disagreement about essence. On the modal account of what essence is, we have no way to capture this disagreement. I mean, presumably, we have to say that this disagreement is illusory or something. So, yeah, I mean, these are some various problems for the modal account. I mean, ultimately, according to Fine, that all of these problems arise from is that the modal account, on the modal account, essence it becomes insensitive to source. So necessity is insensitive to source, whereas essence should be sensitive to source. So in general, if we take some relation between two objects, O1 and O2, let's suppose that this relation holds necessarily. So it's a necessary truth about O1 that it bears this relation to O2. And it's also going to be a necessary truth about O2 that O1 bears this relation to O2, right? I mean, it's just the necessary truth is not sensitive to the source here. And so that's all that can be said. Fine's thought is, well, it may be that O1's bearing this relation to O2, that could be essential to O1, but not to O2. Because the sort of source of that relation perhaps lies in O1 rather than in O2. I mean, so this is the basic problem with the modal account. Well, if the modal account doesn't work, then what's the alternative? Well, Fine favours the definitional account. According to the definitional account, a statement of the essence of an object is basically the same as a statement of the definition of a term. So take the definition of a term like bachelor. By definition, the term bachelor means unmarried man. Well, here we have a proposition which is true in virtue of the meaning of a term. So the proposition, bachelors are unmarried men, that's true in virtue of the meaning of bachelor. Now, when we state the essence of an object, we have a proposition which is true in virtue of the identity of the object. So bachelors are unmarried men, that equally tells us the essence of bachelors, of what it is to be a bachelor. So when I state the essence of some object or set of objects, I give what Fine calls a real definition of the object or set of objects. I tell you what it is to be the object in question. Just as we can define a word or a concept, so we can define an object. To define a word is to say what the word means. So the word bachelor means unmarried man. To define an object is to say what the object is. Now, bachelor is an unmarried man. Now, on this account, essence is sensitive to source. Essence is going to be sensitive to the identity of objects. Is it essential to Socrates that he be a member of the singleton set whose sole member is Socrates? Well, to answer this question, we have to consider what it is to be Socrates. We have to consider Socrates' real definition. And presumably this is going to include something about Socrates' origin, because Socrates is a contingently existing object. Socrates' existence is not determined simply by his own nature, but is dependent on various other contingent circumstances. It will include something about Socrates' personhood. It's going to include only the non-modal properties of Socrates, because of course essence is fundamentally non-modal. But importantly, in none of this are we going to find anything about mathematical sets. Socrates is a concrete object, and the real definition of any object is not going to make reference to objects that are metaphysically disjoint, such as abstract objects. So I mean, it's not going to be essential to Socrates that he be a member of this singleton set. Ultimately, the real definition of an object should do at least two things. And here I'm following Catherine Kozlicki's presentation in the article Modality and Essence in Contemporary Metaphysics. So first of all, it should classify the entity by stating what kind of entity it is. So Socrates is a person, or Socrates is a man, or Socrates is a contingent concrete object, right? We're going to say what kind of thing Socrates is, what kind of, what kind of substance, what kind of thing is he? The second thing a real definition needs to do is differentiate the entity from other entities of its kind. In the case of Socrates, presumably what differentiates him is his specific ancestry, so his parents, say. Now, Fine grants that with many entities, it may not be possible to accomplish this second goal. Perhaps with Socrates, we can't really do this. After all, not just any entity that was created by Socrates' parents would have to be Socrates. He might have had siblings. And so it might be that we just don't know exactly what distinguishes Socrates from all other persons. I mean, of course, we can, in practice, distinguish Socrates, but most of the properties that we are going to take to distinguish Socrates from other people are going to be merely accidental properties, like the fact that Socrates was the teacher of Plato. So we might, parts of the essence might be hidden here, but basically this is what a real definition is going to do. It's going to classify the object by telling us what kind of object is, and it's going to differentiate the object from other objects of its kind. And in some cases, these goals can be achieved. So take the singleton set, the Socrates set. So we can say, so we can just define a set, call it set S, right? We can say S is the singleton set whose sole member is Socrates. And that gives us a real definition of S. It tells us what kind of thing S is. It tells us that it's a mathematical set. And it distinguishes S from all other sets because it specifies S's members exactly. So we can fully specify the essence of S. There's just nothing more to know about what S essentially is. There's nothing more to know about S's identity. And I mean, it's worth noting that our inability to fully specify the essence of some objects probably isn't surprising if essence is analogous to a kind of definition. After all, there are many words in ordinary language for which we're not able to give precise, exact definitions. In the formal sciences, exact definitions are much easier to come by. Perhaps the reason why exact definition is possible in one case but not the other is because of the nature of the objects we are dealing with. It is because essence is accessible in one case but not the other that we can give a precise definition of mathematical sets but not of persons. So that is the definitional account. Now, many philosophers resist the notion of giving a definition of an object. I think that this notion, the definition of an object, would be seen by many people as a kind of category error, right? We can define words, we can define concepts, right? But we mean define an object. Objects just are what they are. You don't define an object, right? Well, Fine, when he talks about defining an object, he means this to be taken quite literally, right? Fine thinks that, we can define objects in much the same way that we can define words and concepts. So consider what's involved in defining a word. I mean, a word is constituted partly by its meaning, right? We can use precisely the same sequence of symbols to represent two different words, as when we use, bank for financial institution or bank for a riverbank. So when we define a word, we specify its meaning, right? And the meaning is, and we sort of distinguish the meaning from various other properties of the word, various other associations we might make when we hear the word. When I say the word bank, that's going to prompt a variety of thoughts, images, feelings, memories, and so on in the minds of people who hear it. And of course, there are many things we can do with the word, many different ways of using it, but all of that can be distinguished from the semantic meaning of the word. So all of these things, the sort of thoughts and feelings and associations, the various things we do with the word, those are merely accidental properties of the word. When we give a definition of a word, we state its meaning, and by stating its meaning, we state its essence. So when I say the word bachelor is defined as unmarried man, I'm stating the essence of the word. I'm telling you what the word is. But then the question is, well, why should it be that only words, concepts, and so on, why should it be that only those things can be given a definition? Why assume that giving a definition can be done only for linguistic items? What's so special? about words. So, you know, like someone like Fine would say, look, I can similarly define water as a substance composed of molecules of one oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms connected by covalent bonds. Now, in this case, I'm not talking about words. I'm not talking about the word water. I'm talking about the liquid in the world. The definition of the word water, that may or may not make mention of oxygen or hydrogen or molecules. After all, people talked about water before they had any idea of modern chemistry. So giving a definition of the word water is not the same as giving a definition of water itself. And why not, right? Why should it be meaningful to define a word but not meaningful to define the thing in the world? So what exactly is the definition of the word water? Well, we're going to say something like this refers to a colorless, tasteless, transparent liquid that quenches thirst and so on. That's the meaning of the word, and that's going to be independent of the sorts of thoughts and feelings and pragmatic uses that we might make of the word. So like when I say water, I mean that perhaps conjures up various images in my head. But the meaning of the word is going to be independent of that. What is the definition of water itself? That's a substance composed of molecules of H2O. That's the real definition of water. That tells us its essence. That tells us what water is, independent of its accidental properties. Well, anyway, that's essence, and that's the modal versus the definitional account of essence, and I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for watching. Bye, everybody.